to congratulate Tim Jackson and Marcia and their team for putting on such an excellently impressive conference. You've got truly some of the best industry leaders here, and most importantly, some of the very best dealers, and very many of you, my friends and acquaintances, so thank you, it's nice to be here. I guess what I'd like to share with you this morning is a perspective on the used car business. And you know, to be sure, it's going to be one that many people don't want to accept. But yet, I think it's one that is very important to at least consider. And that is that there certainly has been a lot of change. I mean, if you just listen to Jared Hamilton, you could have easily sat in this room as I did and wondered if you're really even in the car business. Because it's all new, it's all different. And yet, I'm sure it is the car business. And, you know, followed by Jonathan, who, you know, gives us the perspective of the old-fashioned, but no less important fundamentals. And I want to tell you that if I were a dealer today, I'd be using Jonathan's product because he really designs a product that approaches it from a very practical, logical basis. And, you know, I think part of the challenge that we have as dealers is to try and ferret out the important from the urgent, the good from the so-so, and it's got to be a very confusing environment. But what I'd really like to do is examine sort of the macro view of what's happened to our industry over the past decade, but I think primarily over the past 5 to 7 years. I travel the country routinely, and what I see in almost every market is what I refer to as a new order. There's a new order of dominance in the retail sales industry for automobile dealers. And what I mean by that is that I routinely visit a market and I can identify dealers that at one time were the dominant producers in their market. And today, they do more or less just an average job relative to their competitors. And at the same time, you can identify in most every market a dealer that was relatively obscure and perhaps not even in business 5 to 7 years ago. And today, these dealers represent the new order of dominance for new and used car sales production. And I think that that new order typifies an understanding that has come about that there's a new way to be successful in this business. But, you know, to introduce and to talk about the new certainly has to challenge the old. And specifically what I'm talking about is this, that our industry has grown up learning how to and becoming proficient at exploiting the environment that once existed. And that environment that once existed is what I refer to as the inefficient market. When shoppers did not have access to the information that they do today about what these vehicles are worth and what the alternatives are out in the marketplace, we as dealers more or less had the advantage. The deck of knowledge was certainly stacked in our favor, and we grew up as an industry really understanding how to exploit that. And I guess if I were to boil it down to one word, that is the mantra, I think, for our old industry, it would be the word gross profit. Now, gross profit is a simply sort of, I guess, deceptive word. Because if I talk about gross profit, I could be talking about one or two things, each of which is very different than the other. I could be talking about your average gross profit, or I could be talking about your total gross profit. But to be sure, from the old, inefficient environment from whence we came, when we talk about gross profit in our industry, we're more or less most often talking about average gross profit. A dealership's average gross profit was the moniker of their success in exploiting the inefficient market. How good we were at getting people to pay us more money for our newer used car than they perhaps needed to pay somebody else, exemplified and typified retail automotive excellence. And it perhaps isn't a very pretty thing to admit, but I think it's nevertheless very true. And in today's very efficient marketplace, it becomes very difficult, quite frankly, to get people to pay us more money for our vehicle than they need to pay someone else. And yet, our industry is so vested and heavily entrenched in the strategies of making money, exercising the exploitative techniques of maximizing average gross profit, that I actually know that it's hurting us today. And it's very difficult to stand in front of a lot of dealers who have a lot of overhead, and many of you who have had tremendous financial success in the past, and make a case to you that average gross profit today is not the most appropriate strategy to achieve financial success. I would argue to you and present a case to you that today it is really much more about total gross profit than average gross profit. And I become particularly concerned when I meet and work with you and learn how committed you remain to pursuing financial success by maximizing your average gross profit. You see, what I've come to understand is that we as dealers today actually have much less control over our average gross profit than we think we do. You know, if you stop and think about it, the only way to improve your average gross profit is to sell it for more or to buy it for less. And the fact is that today, or I should say yesterday, in the inefficient market, if we possessed a lot of extraordinary talent, we could often affect many extraordinary gross profit outcomes. And let me explain what I mean. There was a day in our industry not too long ago, and most of all of you will remember it, where if you were an extraordinary used car talent, you could really do some extraordinary things in terms of grosses. If you were a great buyer, you could go to an auction and you could look at a yard of cars, hundreds of cars, and you could identify a couple cars among hundreds that were plain Janes, no special appeal. But because you had a really, really deep understanding of what you could do with that vehicle, you could say, you know, I could make a car out of that car. And because that wasn't obvious to everyone else at the auction that day, you could pull that car out of the auction for a pretty good price. And then you brought it back to your dealership, and if you were an extraordinarily, you know, talented reconditioning operation, and many of you are, or if you're not, you know ones that are, you know what you could do. You could put that plain Jane car in the shop and pull it out of the shop after a while, and what you had on your hands was a spectacular car. And then further, if you were an extraordinary sales talent, you could put that car on the lot, you could encounter a customer and very quickly develop rapport and credibility. You were an excellent negotiator, you had great closing skills, and you had great timing on your TOs. And when you put all of those great traditional used car skills together, what you could routinely do is to get people to pay you a lot more for your car than they actually needed to pay if they only knew others ones were around town for less, and there always were. But today I ask you this question. If you have all of those talents today, how often can you get people to pay you much more for your used vehicle than they need to pay someone else? I mean, can you do that very often today if you've got all of those talents? I think not. You know, can you get them to pay you thousands more on a routine basis for yours if you have all those talents? Certainly not. Maybe a few $100s more, perhaps, sometimes, but very often none at all. So I ask you this question, what's the value of all of those traditional great used car merchandising talents? Why is it that we think that we have all the control over our average gross profit that justifies all the time that we spend working on it? I mean, if we sit in your sales meetings, we're hearing average gross profit, average gross profit, average gross profit. If we stop a dealer on the street and we say, hey buddy, today's, you know, the first third of September is gone, how's your gross profit? They're more likely to tell you about their average than their total. If you sit down to hire a salesperson or a manager in the first 30 seconds of that interview, you're talking about your average gross profit. I've got bad news for you. You have very little control today over your average gross profit.